Hello everyone, welcome back to the Windows Virtual Desktop Partner Learning Series. This is Module 3, Design and Implementation. My name is George Wood. I'm a Cloud Solutions Architect within the OCP team, so partner facing, focusing on infrastructure. Throughout this module, we'll take a look at sort of the overall architecture of Windows Virtual Desktop. We'll take a quick look at that sort of user connection workflow. We'll also take a look at a deployment overview, any considerations that you need to make with a deployment. We'll touch on the auto scaling and the load balancing features of Windows Virtual Desktop that are native to Windows Virtual Desktop. And then finally, we'll touch on migration of an existing RDS remote desktop farm into Windows Virtual Desktop. So to begin with, we've got the architecture and taking a look at that sort of user connection flow, which is quite an important concept to understand. And there is, as you can see here from I guess the state of Windows Virtual Desktop, and if I just sort of talk through this slide a little bit, on the left hand side we've got all of the remote desktop clients. So whether a user is accessing these desktops through an application on their mobile phone, a tablet, or a PC, and they can access it using the actual application, or they can actually log into it using an HTML5 compatible browser. So that really opens up these applications and these desktops to a wide variety of users. These users, as long as they've got access to an HTML5 browser, they will be able to access their desktops and their applications. James showed us a demonstration of what that would actually look like on an iOS device, and that experience is pretty consistent across the board. Then sort of in the middle here, we've got the WVD Tenant itself. So this is all of the objects that are managed by Microsoft, by us. We take responsibility for these roles and ensure their uptime. And then on the right hand side, the desktops, the applications, the Active Directory and the user profiles, those are sort of partner or customer managed. That's what you are responsible for when you are managing Windows Virtual Desktop. And if we just take a look at the current state, there are no outbound connections or sort of, I guess, inbound ports that need to be opened on these desktops, and we'll sort of talk through that in a little bit. That's called a reverse connect. But essentially, in this state, that these desktops have no public IP addresses, which really helps that sort of from that security standpoint. So how does an actual end user start to consume these desktops and these applications? And when they launch their browser or the application, they need to log in to the client, and effectively they're using here their Azure Active Directory credentials to query Azure Active Directory, and that will return a token. And effectively, they can then present that token to the web access layer. The broker will then go, and if they've authenticated correctly, the broker will then go and understand what kind of resources each one of these users has got access to. Do they have access to a few desktops? Do they have access to a few applications? They might have, a different host pools that they've got access to. Once the user selects the resource that they would like to access, so if they would like to select a desktop, the broker will then, once they've connected to the gateway, the broker will then navigate them to the right resource. But effectively, once that sort of connection has been made, once the orchestration of that connection has been made by the broker, the traffic will actually flow between point 3 and 4, so between the gateway and the desktops. And because the traffic flows sort of in that way, you've got to think that because it's got to go through that managed sort of layer by us, it's very important that to get the best experience, and as I spoke about in the previous module, Windows Virtual Desktop is all about that end user experience. To keep the latency as low as possible, you would like to really keep those desktops in the same region as the WVD tenant. And as we know, the WVD clusters are only deployed in certain regions around the world. There is quite a global footprint that I would say now, but it's definitely important to take a look at and find which is the best user experience for you. There is also the estimator tool, which can help you understand which will be the best experience, and that's a good tool just to start to think about using for when you're planning your deployments. So I spoke about sort of the isolation and this reverse connect, which effectively means that there's no requirement for an inbound port on those virtual machines, so you don't have to worry about the the RDP port being opened on there. And effectively, all of the communication is done through port 443, so through HTTPS, and that means that there's quite a lot of flexibility, and also you're using Azure Active Directory as that initial connection, which means that you can enable benefits like multi-factor authentication and conditional access. So conditional access can bring many things, and I think especially with remote working, it's vital that you have the likes of multi-factor authentication and remote or conditional access enabled. And multi-factor authentication, everybody should be using. That's just making sure you are who you say you are. And then with the conditional access, effectively you can actually lock down these desktops. So if a user is actually trying to access this desktop outside of a set of trusted IPs, you can actually really make sure that they actually can't access them outside of that IP range. Or if you would like them to access to, but you'd like just to have that extra layer of security, you can actually prompt them for multi-factor authentication at that stage. So just having that visibility of where your users are connecting from, and to also just have that level of control, it really helps in terms of the governance and the compliance. And also, if we sort of take a look at this, and I should probably build out this slide by now, I think one of the most important things here to note is that the desktops and the applications will actually only connect to that sort of Microsoft managed layer, and that's the real difference between a sort of traditional environment. So looking at Windows Virtual Desktop, we can also enable multi-tenancy. And this means that you can manage multiple customer environments, or potentially you have a customer with different Azure Active Directory forests or Azure ADs or different tenancies, and you can actually connect across all of them. And the benefits here are that the customer environments are completely segregated. They're on their own networks. They've got their own Azure Active Directory, so their own tenants. They've got their own Azure subscriptions as well. And you can actually manage that from one Windows Virtual Desktop layer. One thing also to note is that you can have VPN connections or an express route connection, to your existing infrastructure. So if you've got any line of business applications that you need to access or anything like that, you can absolutely still access those resources by configuring that VPN connection. There is also, and we'll speak about this a little bit later, there is also a strategy to keep your Active Directory server on premises and leverage the VPN connection and the express routes to gain access to that identity. However, as I think we'll speak about, it's probably always a good thing just to spin up an Active Directory server in the same location, just to reduce the time to authenticate as much as possible. So talking about sort of the RDS tenant flexibility a little bit, and this basically just means that there are lots of different configurations possible with remote configuring RDS and WVD. So pretty much as long as you've got an Azure Active Directory subscription, Azure Active Directory tenant, and Azure subscription, you can effectively create that RDS tenant. You can absolutely leverage different subscriptions in a single Active Directory, and that means if you wanted to, you could have different host pools in different Azure subscriptions. Whether you want to do this for cost analytics or for governance or whatever it is, it's completely up to you how you actually set out that RDS tenant and how you set out those host pools. One interesting point is that you can actually host from another Azure Active Directory, and so a good example of this, and this is how I've got my demo environment set up. I've used one of the demo tenants available from sort of demos.microsoft.com or sort of cdx.transform, I think is it's sort of called now, and effectively that Microsoft 365 tenant with all the right licenses, so I get the license entitlement from it, and I get to have all of the users with the full Microsoft 365 story behind it. and also that's connecting to my Visual Studio subscription, which I get working for Microsoft, and effectively I've got my virtual machines hosted on that Visual Studio subscription. And so I don't get many credits in that Visual Studio subscription. I get about £120 a month, maybe, and I can quite comfortably run my Windows Virtual Desktop environment for demonstrations inside of that. So it means getting started can be done very, very cheaply indeed. So taking a look at the sort of host pool flexibility now, we've sort of spoken about the actual sort of, I guess, RDS tenants themselves, but now sort of talking about the actual sort of virtual machines and how you want to maybe set those up and organize them. Initially there are different load balancing algorithms, and it's one of the topics that we will be speaking about later, but effectively you get sort of two options. You get the breadth or the depth strategy. I won't sort of take too long to sort of talk about these now, but it's very important to think about how you are going to be doing your load balancing with all of your different virtual machines, and are you going to be doing it the same way across all of your different host pools, and are you going to change that strategy throughout the day as well? These are all things really to consider when you're thinking about how you're going to be setting up your host pools. Then we've got the differentiation between a single or a multi-session host. A single session is effectively when you've got one user per virtual machine, and multi-session is when you're getting multiple users per virtual machine. Now, the cost saving that you can make in terms of having a multi-session host is pretty good, but you've just got to think, if there are any hungry users that are on those virtual machines, are they better off with a single session host? And then something that I didn't understand for sort of quite a while was that the differentiations between pooled or personal session hosts. And this is when, if you've got a single session host, they can either be pooled or personal virtual machines. And effectively, if you've got a single session and they're accessing a pooled resource, that means they're accessing a pool of virtual machines that they could connect to. So you're not always necessarily guaranteeing that that user will have access to the same desktop every single time. Whereas if you have a single session on a personal host, that single user will be accessing that desktop every single time. So that there are sort of a couple of differentiations to make, and all of these will need to really come into your planning when you're thinking about deploying this for a customer. And finally, we've got obviously the variation in the operating systems that you can use. So whether you want to go for a sort of a Windows Server operating system or a Windows 10 operating system, one of the things to point out here is that the Windows 7 operating system virtual machines cannot do the multi-session hosts. They are single sessions only. So we've got to the deployment overview section, and this is pretty high level, sort of taking a look at all of the different requirements, all of the different considerations that you might want to make when thinking about deploying Windows Virtual Desktop. So there are a few core requirements. One of those is an Azure subscription with all of the associated Azure resources, of course, an Azure Active Directory, and also whether you're going to go for a traditional domain controller or Azure Active Directory domain services, and making sure that you're building out all the credentials within that sort of identity or provider as much as you can. So speaking about sort of, I guess, the identity strategies and going into a bit more depth about this, is we've got, I guess, three main choices that you can choose from here. You can either spin up a domain controller in your Azure subscription, or for sort of, I guess, more cloud-based organizations, use Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is a PaaS service managed by Microsoft, effectively providing you with an Active Directory Domain Services instance, and that will be running at a fixed charge per month, which is good if you want to be able to have some predictable metrics. However, if I'm being honest, it's probably only suitable for those cloud-only organizations. There is a third option that we've sort of not mentioned just yet, and that is if you didn't want to spin up a new domain controller in your subscription, you can leverage an existing domain controller that sits on premises. However, you do still need to then configure the VPN connection or the express route connection into Azure itself. And I think that there are definitely pros and cons to each one. However, at the moment, for me, the recommendation would be, if you're a cloud-only organization, you do not have a hybrid setup, then going for Azure Active Directory domain services would work. However, if you are in a hybrid scenario, and most customers will be in a hybrid environment, I would absolutely go for a virtual machine with Azure, with Active Directory in Azure. So a few network requirements and considerations. So the network must route to a Windows server Active Directory, effectively that, in pretty much line of sight. That server must sync with Azure Active Directory. So AD Connect is the easiest way to do it. Yes, you can do it with ADFS, and that may help with sort of a seamless sign-on experience, but is a bit more in depth to configure. And then the virtual machines themselves must be domain joined to that domain controller. And you can actually see a reflection of this when you are sort of going through that user connectivity. The users are connecting to Azure Active Directory to be able to get the list of resources that they've got sort of, access and visibility of. And then once you select that resource, you then have to authenticate again using the same set of credentials to that virtual machine. A few bits on sort of connectivity and I guess some of the different types of connectivity that we've got here. So ExpressRoute and site to site. ExpressRoute is obviously that dedicated network through a service provider, whereas a site to site VPN will probably provide you with slightly more limited bandwidth compared to an ExpressRoute. But again, different customers will have different requirements. If they already have an ExpressRoute set up, perhaps you want to use that existing connectivity. But if you wanted to connect an SMB customer into Azure, having a site-to-site VPN is a really good way of getting started. And then, as you can see there, the Azure Active Directory domain service is actually an isolated bit of connectivity, and you just need to make sure that those passwords are synchronized to Azure Active Directory so that those identities are pretty much the same across the board. So as I mentioned, the recommended setup for cloud-based or cloud-only organizations is to run Azure Active Directory domain services. So this is a managed service provided by Microsoft, means you don't have to worry about updating it, patching it, worried about uptime or anything like that. There is a cost to the service, but part of that would be offset by not having to do the management, for example. So again, it really depends what type of customers you're looking at. Are they cloud-only organizations? Would they benefit from having, Azure Active Directory domain services set up if they don't already have a domain controller? If they do have an existing domain controller, and even if they're probably looking to migrate to the cloud, I'd probably say that, keep the users the same, synchronize those users from their existing domain controller into the Azure Active Directory. What I would also say is it might be beneficial to deploy an additional domain controller in Azure. That will just keep the latency for authentication as low as possible, and it's always a good thing to sort of have a secondary site as well. And one thing to consider when you're sort of looking at deploying a domain controller in Azure for Windows Virtual Desktop, it might be that domain controller is on all the time. And if that is the case, you may want to look at reserved instances, but you probably also want to look at B-series virtual machines. So B-series virtual machines are actually burstable. So they can burst their compute for a set amount of time. And, for example, during a connection storm early in the morning, 9 a.m., when everyone's, getting connected to Outlook, whatever it is, it might be worthwhile using that burst capability in the morning. And then as, the sort of less users hit that domain controller, you'd effectively be able to sort of earn more credits as that sort of CPU percentage is quite low. And then if there's another connection burst or another sort of big hit on the domain controller, it's been earning credits during that quiet period to again be able to burst out and deal with the extra demand. So that's something inherently part of the B-series virtual machines, and definitely something that you should probably be looking to leverage as part of these deployments. Looking at how we create the Windows Virtual Desktop tenant itself, so how do we actually create that? The first step is to create or to grant access to your Azure Active Directory, so to allow it to make sort of changes or to view your organization. And effectively, you need to take your tenant ID and paste it into a website just to register your Active Directory. Once you've done that, you need to assign a tenant creator, and whether that's a user or service principal, that is something to think about how you're going to be sort of assigning those permissions out. If you are going to be using a user as the tenant creator, be careful, as if that user has got multi-factor authentication enabled, it will most likely fail the deployment of the hosts. And I know that if you're a CSP, there are some security requirements that you need to adhere to, and in that case, it might be best looking at a service principal to do this. And then finally, you go through PowerShell and you actually create that tenant. There is plenty of documentation available on how to get that created and how to sort of create this WVD tenant. And there is a good getting started guide as well, which I would recommend that you go through. As I mentioned, this is deployed through PowerShell, and a lot of the management is also done through PowerShell. So there are just a taster of some of the commandlets that are available. I would also say that at the moment, there is sort of a user interface that you can deploy through GitHub for Windows Virtual Desktop. That uses some of these PowerShell commands basically behind the scenes. You may still need to use some of these sort of PowerShell commands, for example, the disconnect user session. I would also probably take a look at the private preview. There's a good YouTube video at Ignite of a walkthrough of what that sort of page will look like. And if you've got any immediate customer opportunities, that is absolutely something to be thinking of. In terms of performance guidance, and this again will depend on your sort of specific customer environment, but a few sort of tips and tricks here of things that we need to be aware of. I've mentioned this before, but you should make sure that your virtual machines are deployed to the same region as your Windows virtual desktop clusters. Making sure those virtual machines are right sized. I probably sound like a bit of a broken record, but Windows Virtual Desktop is all about that user experience, and if the right users aren't getting access to a GPU enabled virtual machine and they're doing CAD design, they're probably not going to be very happy with that user experience. So make sure that the right people have got access to the right tools. I would also look to leverage Windows 10 multi-session and create a relatively user-dense solution that will create the most cost-effective option. But again, you need to sort of offset cost with that user experience and understand which is best. And finally, just the last recommendation here that I'd like to point out is really sort of taking a look at sort of mixing your breadth and depth scaling to figure out which and how many users you're going to have on specific virtual machines at specific times. You may even want to switch these load balancing rules around throughout the course of a day. And that is something to look into in terms of automation, and definitely an area where partners can start to add value. So on the auto scaling and load balancing, this is a very high level overview, just a couple of points about each one, just to give you a bit of a flavor for what you can do natively within the tool. So as you can see here, we've got a bit of PowerShell again, and you can effectively specify a tenant, specify a host pool, and actually change whether that is a breadth first or a depth first load balanced solution. You might also want to, again, as I said, change these over the course of the day. So a breadth first load balancing would be, if you've got 3 servers as the example here, and you've got 5 users, those users will be spread across those virtual machines as much as possible. And one thing that is quite nice natively within this tool, you can actually add a session limit. So if you only want 2 users per host, or 3 or 4, whatever it is, or 50, you can actually set that limit as well, which can help in terms of planning, but can also help in terms of that user experience. And then in terms of depth first, right, you're just trying to add as many users to a virtual machine as possible, but again, you've got sort of that session limit. So if you did only want to add 2 users per virtual machine before going to the next one, that is absolutely something that can be done. So how does auto-scaling work at the moment? Auto-scaling previously was all done, through PowerShell. You'd need to configure it yourself. It is still that way at the moment. However, we now have documentation that goes through how to run a Logic app, or how to get an automation account to run a Logic app that will connect to the Windows Virtual Desktop and actually assess if any virtual machines need to be started or stopped. And there's a whole XML configuration file, and the documentation on this is quite thorough. That will go through all of the different parameters that you can control. So, figuring out stop times, figuring out busy periods, all of those sorts of things to help you understand the best way to do your auto scaling. I would absolutely recommend making sure you're doing something with the logs. Even if that's just reviewing the logs on a regular basis. At the end of the day, you need to make sure that your auto scaling is working as intended. And absolutely, this is value that can be added by a partner. So a bit of advice on sizing and extending these host pools. So if you are migrating from an existing environment, and you have issues in that existing environment, and you're trying to move to Windows Virtual Desktop, if you're going from point A to point B, it's a really good idea to know what point A looks like or where point A is, so that you know how to get to point B as well. So for me, using ISV tools to really look at how they can help you understand your environment. There are some native tools as well that Azure Migrate is one of those tools that can help you understand what that environment would look like in Azure. But I would also recommend going a bit deeper, not just looking at the infrastructure, but looking at the networking and any of the storage and anything like that that would actually have an impact on the sort of environment going forwards and being moved to Azure. The next point is quite an interesting one. So do you choose between less virtual machines with more users or more virtual machines with less users? And again, it might differ even within a customer environment. You might have different host pools with different tactics. One thing that I would say on this point is the more virtual machines that you've got, the more disks that you're going to need to provision, those operating system disks that every virtual machine needs. The more of those virtual machines that you provision, the more of those disks that you've got, the more of a cost you have. So there's a real trade-off there in terms, again, of that user experience versus cost. And then the image management, please automate that as much as possible. And there is a session in module 4. There will be a bit of a deeper explanation on that, so we won't steal their thunder. So now the final section, which is migration, quite an important one. If you're looking to migrate from an existing set of infrastructure, how do you go about doing that? And really, this specific example is looking at going from a more traditional RDS farm over to Azure. And you've got 3 different stages. You've got the planning and design stage, you've got the POC stage, and the migration stage. One thing that I would say about all of those stages is they're so crucial. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So getting a really good understanding of all of the existing RDS environment on premises. So using tools, as I just mentioned, like Azure Migrate or any of the third-party ISV tools out there to really help you understand that picture of what's going to happen when you actually move to Azure. Once you've understood all of that, creating a POC is very important. And as part of that POC, one thing that I would stress is get that user acceptance testing done. Make sure that you have stressed the system a little bit with a few users, and get that user feedback and understand if there are any things that need to be changed before actually putting it into production. Because at the end of the day, with the sort of, with remote desktop solutions, the user experience is the most important thing, and you need to make sure that those users will be happy within that environment, and at the end of the day they will ultimately define whether this project has been a success or not. And that is probably one of the most challenging things about deploying Windows Virtual Desktop. On the sort of planning and design stage, it's if you've got your existing naming conventions bring them with you into Azure. You don't necessarily want to have, two completely different environments on premises and in Azure. However, if you don't have any sort of naming conventions, we've got some best practices around naming conventions. I would actually just say in general, take a look at that best practices site. We've got some fantastic bits of architecture just to go through, and if you're unsure of how to create a hub and spoke design or whatever it is, there's tons of architecture on there and best practices. It's very, very it's a good read. And then a bit on the sort of discovery and assessment piece. I won't spend too long talking about this because I have already spoken about Azure Migrate, but you can effectively assess the session host and exclude the core services, because at the end of the day, those core services, so things like the connection broker, the SQL database, the gateway, they're not coming with you because Windows Virtual Desktop will be managing those environments. So that's an inherent cost saving that you're making, but also allows you to be a bit more particular about your assessment. So we have spoken about these sizing guidelines in module 2, but it might be worth just sort of going through these again. So I'll do it very quickly though. So we've got anything from a task worker to a power worker, and you've got you can probably fit the most task workers into a virtual machine, and you probably want to have less power users or power workers in those heftier virtual machines. But the ability of Azure to pretty much cater to your needs. So if you do need a virtual machine that has got GPU enabled, that's no problem. But then we've also got those general purpose virtual machines. So it's trying to figure out how many users, what types of virtual machines will they have, and also what type of storage will they have. Are they going to be using virtual machines with storage spaces direct? Are they going to be using Azure files now that you can integrate that to Active Directory, or are you going to be using Azure NetApp files if you're working with a larger organization? There are lots of things to take into consideration there, and I would say that these are relatively basic requirements, and that you should probably use these as your basis, and then as you add applications, as you add different things, build on top of these requirements. A bit of an example, I guess, and taking a look at some guidelines here, and these are really examples of what it might look like. So this is looking at 100 users of each sort of persona. They've also specified a maximum of 50 users per server, so that could really help when it comes into consideration for pricing. And they always say always use at least 2 session hosts. So for me, those are 2 session hosts that you might want to say, hey, should we be looking at reserved instances for these 2, as they're going to be turned on 24/7. So taking a step back from the pricing quickly and looking at just a high level architecture of what a network may look like in Azure. So you have your hub virtual network, and then your WVD estate is effectively one of those spokes. And you've also, as you can see here on the left hand side, you've also got your on-premises connected into Azure using that site-to-site tunnel. One thing to note is if you did want to wrap around your Windows Virtual Desktop services with a third-party firewall or with the Azure firewall, that is absolutely fine. You may just want to look at your routing just to make sure all of the right routes are in place. And I guess we're sort of coming back to migration, and when you're thinking about migration, you've got to think about how you really want to sort of deploy this infrastructure. Do you want to deploy it in parallel? So would you like to have your existing RDS farm and Windows Virtual Desktop at the same time, sort of side by side? And there are a few considerations to make around this. For me, probably the main consideration is a cost consideration. If you are running them both side by side, there is a cost portion of this that you'd need to consider. However, it does give you a huge amount of flexibility. So if you did want to actually test what those applications are like, if you did want to get your users to see if they actually preferred having that full Windows 10 experience, will they actually use the benefits that come with the entitlement to FS Logics and all of these sorts of things? That's really where this of having that parallel infrastructure is a real benefit. I personally see that as probably a really good option. I think moving towards Windows 10 multi-session is definitely something that partners should be looking at. There's real value for those end users of being able to leverage sort of native services like OneDrive much easier. And then the I guess another migration approach is the lift and shift migration approach, which you can leverage Azure Migrate and Azure Site Recovery to help you with. And that's great if you've got sort of some persistent virtual machines to be migrated to Azure. You must note that if you're going to be migrating them to WVD, you'll basically be replicating those virtual machines into Azure, so you won't be able to modernize to Windows 10 multi-desktop or multi-session. That's really important, and it's not that easy to deploy custom images when you're trying to do that. So, there's pros and cons to both. If you're doing a lift and shift approach, there may be less of a cost implication. However, if you're running it in parallel, you probably get a bit more flexibility with what you're trying to do, and you also get to explore that full Windows 10 experience, which I'd definitely recommend. And that's really it from me today. That's pretty much an overview of sort of the Windows Virtual Desktop deployment. Thank you very much for your time, and speak to you soon. Cheers.